Welcome to Kent Hance, the best storyteller in Texas podcast. You can find us online at hancepodcast.com. Follow us on Instagram at Best Storyteller Podcast, and we love hearing from you. Feel free to email us, info@hancepodcast.com. Chancellor Hance, what is your saying of the day?
If it's too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. But you're going to make a little money and people come to you with investments and deals, and there'll be some outlandish deals. And the better it is, the more you need to look at it. You need to be skeptical that somebody may be trying to say, the Brooklyn Bridge or something. And maybe they're a little smoother. I think back, my dad, we were cotton farmers. He was a mail carrier and a cotton farmer. And we had problems in the 50s with boll weevils. And he was listening. He was listening one night to XELO in Chihuahua, Mexico, that had like 200,000 watts.
Yeah.
You turn the radio on, they just blow it off the stand almost. And that was before they signed the international agreement, and there has to be, you couldn't, broadcast with them. But they had a deal, an ad about killing boll weevils, and it was 100% guaranteed that it would kill every boll weevil it came in contact with. And he listened, and you had to order from Atlanta, Georgia. There was a company in Atlanta selling them. And so I think it was like $25, maybe $50, but it's a lot of money to us. I think carrying the mail, he was making about $200, $250 a month. And so $25, $50, that's a lot of money. And he sent his money in, he got back in the mail this kit. And there were two pieces of wood, and one had an X on it, and you were supposed to get the boll weevil and put him on the X and then slam it with the other piece of wood. And I'll tell you, when he opened that and read it and everything, we were all looking. If he had had the money and the time to drive to Atlanta, somebody would have been whipped, and it wouldn't have been him. There was a guy in West Texas, I won't go into his last name, but he had a nickname, Ducky. And Ducky sold a deal called the Satinizer. And the Satinizer, it looked like an end table. And it had a couple of spouts on it. And one you'd pour in cheap whiskey. And the other, it would come out, would be Chivas Regal, And so he set it up at the Pioneer Hotel. He had a suite of rooms there in a big living area, and invited these lawyers and doctors and dentists by. And look, if you're going to run a scam, always call a bunch of lawyers and dentists and doctors who are making a lot of money. Mm-hmm. They won't know what to do with it, and they probably won't have a personal advisor, and they might buy it.
Right.
And so he called them in, and when they got there, he had just filled it up, and it had this old empty, cheap whiskey bottles there by the Satinizer. And so he turned it on, and it makes these sounds. It'll be whirling and makes some sounds and everything, and leaves it on for 4 or 5 minutes and turns it off, and then starts pouring everybody a drink. Well, it tastes like Chivas.
Yeah.
Now, the main reason it tastes like Chivas, he'd filled it up with Chivas. And that rot gut he had poured down the drain. And everybody had 2 or 3 drinks, and by the time they had that third or fourth drink, it had run out, so he had to fill it up again, and he filled it up with cheaper whiskey, but by then it all tasted good. And so they bought stock left and right, and he got indicted on a theft charge and securities violation. And he was represented by a lawyer named Byron Chappell. And Byron was one of the funniest guys I've ever met, and he had a lot of wisdom. And Byron, was talking about it and told me all about the Satinizer. Well, lots of times in Congress, when you're waiting on votes to take votes, you'll have some dead time in the cloakroom. And I told that story about the Satinizer.
Yeah.
And Richard Shelby, who's now appropriations chair, has been chair, and from Alabama. We went to Congress at the same time, and my best friends, and still talk on a regular basis. And he loved that story, and he called Chappell.
Oh, he did?
And he said, yeah, I want to know if that story's true. It's so good.
Yeah.
And he said, if it's not true, I'm still going to use it. But if it's true, I'm going to use your name also. Well, Chappell loved it.
Yeah.
Chappell thought that was the greatest thing that I'd ever done for him, that, someone of the stature of U.S. Senator Richard Shelby would call him. And Shelby was in the House at the time, but went on to the Senate. And he told me, yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
And so he told him the story, and it checked out with what I'd told him. So Shelby used that story for a long time. But when Chappell died, in his will, he left me the Satinizer. And I've still got it at my house in Lubbock, and I'll always keep it in that, somebody leaves me something like that. My wife didn't think it was very good looking, but it's got a great story to it.
Right.
And so the Satinizer, Ducky had been in trouble before, and I think that's what probably got him this time. In Oklahoma, they caught him selling rechargers to lightning rods. People that have lightning rods out in the country on their house is the tallest thing around, and the lightning rods are grounded so that it wouldn't burn up your house. And he'd go out and recharge them, and he had a welding machine, and he'd hook up to them, and sparks would fly.
Yeah.
And he'd charge them, $25, $30, and he could do 10 or so a day, and that's a lot of money.
So he was just recharging the rods that were already there.
But
okay.
They didn't need recharging.
Right.
They didn't. There was nothing to it. I mean, it was just a scam.
Right.
And he was pretty good at scams. He invented a bed one time that when the baby woke up, it rocked it back to sleep. And I think they have something like that in high technology now.
Yeah.
But they didn't back in the 50s and 60s. And he had Ducky Bed International. And rented a vacant warehouse and put on the side of it Ducky Bed International, Southwest Division, Lubbock, Texas. And people bought stock. But I think Chappell used to tell that one time the grand jury let him go on a deal, that they promised not to do it again. And he forgot what the foreman of the grand jury looked like. In about 3 or 4 months, he tried to sell it to him. And that didn't last. That wasn't real good.
That one did him in?
It did him in. Crime doesn't pay. It'd eventually catch up with you. My son-in-law, Phil Sorrells, is a judge in Fort Worth. And last year, he's setting some bonds on people. And this guy came in the courtroom, and he had his buddy with him. And the buddy had on a T-shirt that said "Wanted" in all 50 states. And it was like he was a handsome guy and the women wanted him. But it said "Wanted" in all 50 states. So Judge Sorrells, Phil Sorrells, had his bailiff go back and ask to see the guy's driver's license. And they ran a check on it, and he wasn't wanted in all 50 states, but he was wanted in one, and they arrested him right there in the courtroom. Don't wear a stupid shirt into a judge's court. Don't ask for problems. And that's what he was doing, and they arrested the guy in the courtroom at that time. Today we're going to talk about some business people that I dealt with and that were pretty unusual people and pretty dynamic. Boone Pickens comes to mind. Boone wasn't like Ducky. Boone did, he always followed the law, and he always had Baker Botts helping him make sure that he's crossing every T and dotting every I. But Boone, when he died, you had to have a funeral ticket. You had to have a ticket to get in the funeral. It's kind of like the McCain. When John McCain, I got a ticket to his funeral, or George H.W. Bush. I went to 3 funerals in about 2 years where you had to have a ticket. When I was growing up in Dimmitt, you didn't have to have a ticket to get in the funeral.
Can I ask a question? Did the ticket just arrive, or did you have to request, or how did?
They sent out a notice to friends, people on his email address, and you call them, and they'd overnight it to you, email it to you,
Gotcha.
and you can pick it up. And so my friend Alan White, who's a highly successful banker from Lubbock and started Plains Capital Bank, and is now statewide. Alan was a student of mine. I tell people, if Alan hadn't had me for business law, he'd be living under a overpass or something. He'd be fighting as a homeless guy. No, that's not true, but he was highly successful. And he did Eulogy. He and Jerry Jones did the Eulogy at Boone's funeral. And so afterwards we were talking, and Alan said there's nothing more than Boone would like to know that people had to have a ticket getting that funeral. And I said, I can think of one. I said, if people had been scalping those tickets outside, Boone would like that even better. He had said they were, Boone always had the talk of rake a little off the table. Like you're playing poker, and if you make a big deal, put a little aside in case things get bad. And he was good at that. But Boone, he grew up in Amarillo. He really grew up in Holdenville in Oklahoma. Moved to Amarillo, and he was in high school. Was a pretty good basketball player. And he was graduating, and Texas Tech offered him scholarship. Polk Robinson offered him scholarship. And his high school coach talked him into staying one more year so they could win state championship. They'd gone to the state tournament. And so he stayed another year, and then he called Tech. Said he was ready to come get his scholarship. And they said, well, that was last year. We gave it away. And unfortunately for Texas Tech, they'd given it away. He went to A&M, and A&M didn't treat him right. And so he transferred to Oklahoma State, and Oklahoma State came out hundreds of $1 million ahead by having Boone Pickens as an alum. He was a big-time Oklahoma State Cowboy alum. But Boone did a couple of deals with a guy that I knew in Lubbock named RH Fulton. And R.H. Fulton was most unusual. He was a character of all characters. And R.H. Fulton one time told me, he said, remember this, if you don't pay your bills, you get to keep the money. That's profound. He was an unusual guy. He'd smoke, and he'd just pitch he didn't have an ashtray, he'd just throw them on his desk. Wow. And sometimes you go in there and see him, there'd be 5 or 6 cigarettes still smoldering, and they'd sweep his desk at night. Wow. And he was just an unusual guy. He'd made his money in pipeline, and then he bought a bank. The bank is what later that Alan White bought. It was Plains National. And but in the early 60s, Boone was doing a deal with R.H. Fulton, and R.H. owed him some money, owed him $600,000. And in early 60s, $600,000, that's still a bunch of money today, but it was a tremendous amount of money. Yeah. And Boone owed the bank, and he was getting a little pressure, and so he drove to Lubbock from Amarillo and went to see R.H. He said, R.H., I got to have my money. And R.H. was at the bank building where he owned the bank, and he got out a big checkbook, and he wrote out a check to Boone Pickens for $600,000, tore it out, and he said, is this the right amount? Boone said, yeah. And then he finished the check and folded it and put it in an envelope, sealed it, put on there Boone Pickens, and gave it to him. Boone put it in his sport coat pocket and whistled and sang all the way back to Amarillo. He was so happy he had gotten that money. And he gave the envelope to the secretary when he got back to Amarillo, and he said, tell him to deposit that and apply it against the note. And she came back in about 10 minutes. She said, they won't take the check, Mr. Pickens. And he said, why? She said, R.H. didn't sign it. Oh. And so he called him, and they said, he's gone to Africa. He just left. He'll be back in 6 weeks. And, he had 6 weeks that he had use of that money. And Boone was down there at the bank, trying to make sure that they realized that he is eventually going to get that money. But he was a character. And, if you look at Boone, Boone had a lot of good stories, but he said none better than R.H. Fulton. In his book, he talks about R.H. Fulton, and he needed R.H. to sign some papers. And R.H. was hiding out at his ranch in Vega, Texas. He had a 110,000-acre ranch up there on the Canadian River. And so he went to see R.H. and knocked on the door, and he stuck his head in and went in and said, R.H., it's Boone, I got it. And somebody said something. He went back to a bedroom, and there was somebody in bed, but they had the head covered up. And he said, all right, you got to sign this paper. I got to get this signed. And he put the paper under the sheet, with a pen, and it came back with RH, and so he was a notary, and he notarized it and left. He said, I knew it was his voice and everything. I didn't see him. And he said, for some reason, RH didn't want to see him. And so that was just, but Boone had that in his book, and it's a pretty good chapter when he talks about RH Fulton. And but Boone, he had some great stories.
What a character!
Yeah,
R.H. Fulton.
R.H. Fulton, and Boone was a colorful guy.
Was he?
And and he when Boone said somebody's an unusual character, they were an unusual character, and that was R.H. I'd also talked about business people that were really good and did well, and I would be amiss if I didn't mention J. Fred Busey. And J. Fred Busey grew up on a farm in Tahoka, Texas. Tahoka's got about 2,000 people. And it was in Tahoka. At one time, from Tahoka, Texas, growing up and graduate was Tahoka High School, there was somebody on the Texas A&M board, the Texas Tech board, and the SMU board.
Wow.
3 different people. And so a little town like Tahoka, they turned out some people.
Yeah, they did.
And they turned out also the late Froy Salinas, who was a state representative in Lubbock. Mm-hmm. He grew up in Tahoka. And he's worth another chapter we'll get to one of these days.
All right.
But, J. Fred Busey grew up, his dad was a farmer, and his chemistry teacher in high school realized that he had a lot of talent. And so she went to see Mr. Busey, and she said, Mr. Busey.
His dad?
Yep.
Okay.
I can get Fred a scholarship to a college, a great school, MIT. Mm-hmm. He said, where is it? She said, it's in Cambridge, Massachusetts, next to Boston. He said, who do they play in football? She said, I don't know if they play football or not. He said, well, if he goes up there and that school goes broke, I can't go get him. It's too far away. He said, I've been to Texas Tech and watched him play football on Saturdays. And if he goes broke, I can go get him, or he can hitchhike home. And he's not going to MIT. And she tried and just finally gave up. And J. Fred Busey went to Texas Tech. Mm-hmm. He majored in physics and graduated with a 4.0.
He was exceptional.
He was exceptional. He was really smart. And his physics professors encouraged him to get a master's. And he got a master's in physics and went to MIT. And so he finally got to MIT. The teacher knew that he needed to be there somehow, but he finally got to MIT. And he later went to work for Texas Instruments and was president of Texas Instruments for a long time and served on the Texas Tech Board of Regents for a period of 18 years. And that I was having breakfast with him in Washington in 1981, and it was in May. And the Washington Post had a big story the morning we had breakfast that I was involved with President Reagan in putting the tax cut together, that I was going to be the sponsor in the House. And so we had breakfast at the Hyatt in Washington, D.C., there on New Jersey. And we were there, and he said, do you know, did they put on capital gains, did they put an incremental investment tax credit for research and development? I said, I don't remember anything in the bill like that. We'd gone over the bill. And, it was the president's bill, but I got to add some things because I was carrying it. And he said, there's nothing more important than an incremental investment tax credit for research and development. Because if we're going to stay ahead on research and development of other countries, then we need to be given a tax break to companies that have a lot of research and development, R&D. It's an R&D issue. It's important to the United States. And he told me pretty straight terms, you need to get that in there. And all of a sudden he said, those people are going to take your calls, who do you deal with? And that's why I've been dealing with, different people. And Don Regan is the point person, the Secretary of Treasury. He reached his pocket and pulled out a dime, and he said, go call him and tell him to put that incremental investment tax credit in there. And Fred was a guy that didn't take no for an answer, and I'd known him a long time. He'd been a good friend and everything, and so I didn't want to turn it, down. And so I had his number for his assistant, and I called her, and she answered the phone. I said it was really important that I talk to Mr. Regan and Secretary Regan. And so she got him on the line. Mm-hmm. And all this was falling in place. And I told him it's critical that we get an incremental investment tax credit for research and development to encourage more research and development. And he listened, and he said, that's a good point. He said, let me see if I can't work that out. And later that afternoon, I met with him. He said, I put the R&D, incremental investment tax credit, in there. It's still in there today. Wow. And that it's encouraged development. It's encouraged, all these high-tech companies doing different things on the internet, and encouraged transportation, banking, everyone to do more research and development. At one time, it looked like Obama was going to take it out, mm-hmm. and it was threatened, but there were enough people stood up for it. So that thing's still there because Fred Busey gave me a dime to call Secretary Regan.
You must have thought the world of Fred Busey then.
I did. I respect him as much as anybody I'd known, and I didn't want to tell him I didn't try.
Right.
And I wasn't going to act like I tried and not try. I was going to be truthful with him, and I could go back and say, I tried. Right. And I told him, they got to call me. And I told the lady, and she, I waited probably a couple of minutes, seemed like 2 days, yeah. But he got on the phone, and he was an unusual guy in that Regan. Somebody told me one time that Don Regan thought he was a 4-star general, and everybody he dealt with was a private, first class. And but he became chief of staff. He and Jim Baker was chief of staff, and they switched positions. Don became chief of staff, and Baker became Secretary of Treasury. But Regan got fired in that he had a run-in with Nancy Reagan. Now remember this, don't have a run-in with the spouse of your boss. You're not going to win.
Right.
And she was reading horoscopes, and she didn't like his schedule. She wanted it done a different way. And he commenced to tell her that was a dumb idea or something, and hung up on her, supposedly. And he called Mike Deaver, Mike Deaver was kind of like a son for the Reagans. And Mike Deaver told him, hey, you better call back and apologize. And he called back and said, hey, I was just trying to get across to you such and such. And, and they got into it again. She, didn't like what he was saying. He hung up again. And anyway, he was fired the next day. They let him go. So, that's another good, don't get in a fight with the spouse of your boss. Unless they file for divorce or something, then, you can check with the spouse and ask if that's okay. But I think that you look at what happened in the tax bill, I think that may have been the most important thing in the tax cut.
Be great to know the return on that, the dividends that paid, that tax credit paid was probably tremendous.
It was huge. And, it was very important. I think that people, that was a part of the tax cut that had long-lasting impact on this country and on the world to increase research and development. Research and development, what's it all about? That's the reason the United States has done so well over the years, that we have entrepreneurs that are willing to take a chance. And in a situation where you've got capitalism, people are always willing to take a chance because they might wind up, being the next Jeff Bezos.
Amazon.
Amazon. or they might be a Bill Gates, or they might be a Warren Buffett, or, they've got to be able to take a chance. And the key, I think, is that you have to be able to know what the odds are. Do not take foolish chances and thinking, well, if I do this, maybe if I go to the Vegas and bet on 1 in 64, it'll come. I mean, that's just crazy. Don't do that. Save your money. But, I asked Bob Hurd, who was the guy the Petroleum Engineering Department at Texas Tech's named after. I asked his wife, Pat, one time about how Bob had done so well. He had made hundreds of millions of dollars and was a very generous guy. He gave it back to the community and to Texas Tech and other things. And she said he was a gambler, but he always knew his odds. And so he may have been a gambler, but he wasn't much of a gambler. He knew what the odds were on pulling off certain things, and that he had no fear. And I think that's something that Boone Pickens, he didn't have much fear, and because he knew he was right. I think you need to have some fear, and they both did, so you don't try ridiculous things. But I think in closing out today, remember, if it's too good to be true, it is. Don't get into something that's too good to be true. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's stories, and I hope you'll like and subscribe to the podcast, and also email your friends and text your friends and tell them to join.